His hands were already reaching for my wrist before he finished saying, "Excuse me." He was old enough to be my grandfather, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that doesn't come from good genes but from decades of being told to stand straight. He wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at the watch. Not the way people glance at someone's watch to check the time. The way someone looks at a photograph of a person they buried 20 years ago. "Where did you get that?" he said. His voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. The room behind us was full of people in blazers holding wine glasses, talking loudly about grant funding and research milestones. A Science Foundation benefit dinner, the kind of event where everyone shakes the same 3 hands all night. I had been standing near the dessert table, not talking to anyone, wondering how long I had to stay before I could leave. "It was my grandfather's," I said. He let go of my wrist slowly. He took one breath, then another. "Your grandfather," he repeated. "What was his name?" "Vincent Alderman," I said. "He passed away 2 months ago." The man closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them, something had shifted in his face. Not grief, exactly. More like recognition of something he had been waiting for and dreading at the same time. "I need to speak with you," he said. "Not here." That was the moment I understood that the man I had buried in a plain pine casket with 11 people in attendance was not who any of us believed he was. My grandfather, Vincent Alderman, lived in a gray house on the edge of Calvert, Indiana. Small town. The kind of place where the grain elevator is the tallest building and the high school football schedule gets printed in the local paper with as much urgency as national news. He had lived in that house for as long as anyone could remember. Longer than my mother had been alive. Longer than the hardware store on Main Street, which had changed hands twice before finally closing in 2019. He worked as a watchmaker. That was what everyone knew about him. He had a small shop on Birch Street, narrow and dim, with rows of clocks on every wall and a magnifying lens clipped to his glasses most of the day. People brought him their grandmother's anniversary pieces and their father's military watches and the broken carriage clocks they'd inherited and didn't know what to do with. He fixed them all. Quietly, carefully, without much conversation. My mother used to say he was the most patient man she had ever known. What she meant, I think, was that he made her feel rushed by comparison, which she didn't like admitting. My father said less. He said my grandfather was fine and left it at that. I was the one who called him every Sunday. I was the one who drove out to Calvert twice a year, sometimes more, just to sit with him on the porch and listen to him talk about things that had nothing to do with my life. Crop prices. The history of the town's founding. The mechanics of a pocket watch spring. I didn't always understand what he was saying. I didn't need to. I just liked being in the orbit of someone that, still. He was 81 when he got sick. It came on fast, the way it does with men who have never once complained about their bodies. By the time the diagnosis was real, it was already too late for most of what the doctors offered. He declined the aggressive options. He said he'd lived long enough to know the difference between fighting and prolonging, and he wasn't interested in the second one. My mother flew in for one weekend, looked overwhelmed, said she'd come back when things got worse, and flew back to Phoenix. She didn't come back. My father had retired and was traveling with a group of college friends through Portugal. He said he'd cut the trip short if necessary. It was never necessary, according to him. My uncle, my mother's brother, sent a card. I took 2 weeks of personal leave from my job as a physical therapist in Cincinnati and drove to Calvert and stayed. I slept in the guest room where the wallpaper had been the same pale yellow for 40 years. I made soup from the recipes he couldn't read anymore because his eyes were going. I sat with him in the evenings when the light got low and the house got quiet. He died on a Tuesday in March. I was in the kitchen when it happened. The hospice nurse was with him. She came to find me in that way nurses do, gentle and practiced, and I knew before she said anything. I sat beside his bed for a long time after. His hands were folded. He looked smaller than he had in life, which was strange because he had always seemed small, quiet, contained. but now he looked like a version of himself that had been carefully packed away. The funeral home said 11 people attended the service. I counted 12, but I might have been wrong. My mother wore sunglasses inside the church. My father arrived 20 minutes late and stood near the door. After the burial, people went to the church hall and ate the sandwiches the ladies' auxiliary had prepared and talked about things that had nothing to do with my grandfather. I was the one who went back to his house. My mother had already called a realtor. No sense in the property sitting, she said. Property taxes don't pause for grief. I wasn't sure she felt any grief. I wasn't sure she knew how to feel it for someone she had mostly left alone for 30 years. I spent 3 days in his house going through his things. Most of it was what you'd expect. Clothes folded with unusual precision, a modest kitchen, a shelf of reference books on horology, the study of timekeeping, worn smooth at the spines, framed photographs of no one I recognized in the back bedroom that he'd never explained. The shop was harder. I drove over on the second day with boxes and found everything in perfect order, which shouldn't have surprised me. Every tool in its place. Every unfinished repair tagged and labeled with the owner's name and phone number and a brief description of the problem. There were 6 pieces still waiting. I called all 6 people. Each one was surprised to hear from me, and each one expressed condolences I could tell were genuine, because they said things like, "He fixed my mother's watch 3 years ago, and I never thought anyone else could do it, and he was the only person in 4 counties who even understood what that movement was." I was packing the display case when I found it. Behind the second shelf, behind a row of replacement crystals and mainspring coils in labeled envelopes, there was a flat metal tin, the kind that might have held mints or small candies. No label. I almost set it aside without opening it. Then I didn't. Inside was a watch. Not a customer's watch. I could tell immediately because it wasn't tagged. Everything else in that shop was tagged. This was small and plain, a pocket watch style, but fitted with a wire clip on the back as though it had once been worn differently. The case was silver, scratched at the edges from use. When I opened it, the face looked normal at first. Roman numerals, a second hand, a small date window. But the bezel, the outer ring, was engraved on the inside with a sequence of what looked like random characters, numbers and letters mixed, grouped in sets of 5, with no obvious pattern, not decorative, too precise to be decorative. The kind of careful, deliberate work my grandfather was capable of. But this wasn't his handwriting, and the engraving itself was old. I remembered seeing it once when I was maybe 10. He had taken it out to show me how a particular movement worked. I asked him what the letters meant, and he said it was an old code from an old game he used to play, and smiled and put it away, and that was that. I had forgotten it completely until the moment I held it in the tin again. I put it in my jacket pocket without quite knowing why. 2 weeks later, a colleague of mine invited me to a benefit dinner for a science foundation she supported. Black tie. Downtown Cincinnati. The kind of event where the rubber chicken is served with a view. I went because she had asked 3 times, and I had declined twice, and I was running out of polite reasons. I wore a plain black dress. I put the watch in my purse, almost as an afterthought. I had been carrying it since I found it, moving it from bag to bag. The way you keep something close when you don't know what to do with it yet. I was at the dessert table when I noticed the man watching me. He wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at my left hand, where I'd been holding the watch loosely while I waited for the line to move. He was in his late 60s, maybe early 70s. Gray blazer, no tie. The kind of bearing that suggests someone who spent years being accountable for other people's lives. He walked toward me. He said, "Excuse me." He reached for my wrist. And then he said, "Where did you get that?" His name was Dr. Bernard Cho. He had been a senior research physicist at a government-contracted laboratory outside of Washington for over 30 years before retiring to Cincinnati to be near his daughter. He gave me his business card at the benefit dinner and asked me to call his office the next morning. He didn't explain anything else. He just said it was important, thanked me for my time, and walked away in the unhurried way of a man who had learned long ago that urgency was best worn on the inside. I didn't sleep well that night. I called my mother instead, which was a mistake. I told her about the watch, about the engraving, about Dr. Cho's reaction. He was probably just admiring it, she said. Dad had a lot of nice pieces. People always wanted to buy them off him. He didn't ask to buy it, I said. He asked where I got it. Well, what did you tell him? That it was Grandpa's. And he went completely pale and asked me to call him in the morning. My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather collected things his whole life. Old watches, old tools, old books. It was probably something he found at an estate sale and someone recognized it. Don't turn it into a mystery." He maintained that shop for 40 years, I said. He tagged every single item. This was the only thing in there with no tag. She changed the subject. My father was less dismissive and more bored. "Your grandfather was a watchmaker," he said, when I called him the next morning before dialing Dr. Cho's number. He dealt in antiques, basically. Something valuable turned up. Find out what it's worth and move on. That's not what it felt like, I said. Feelings aren't information, my father said. I hung up and called Dr. Cho. His office was in a plain 2-story building near the University of Cincinnati campus. Professional, but modest. No photos on the walls, no awards, just a long conference table and 2 chairs and a window facing the parking lot. He was already there when I arrived. He had brought coffee without asking how I took it. He pushed the cup toward me and folded his hands and looked at me the way someone looks at you when they are deciding how honest to be. "I owe you an explanation for how I behaved," he said. "You just surprised me," I said. I surprised myself. He looked at the watch which I had placed on the table between us. I hadn't seen one of these in 30 years. I wasn't prepared. "One of these?" He nodded slowly. "Your grandfather's name was Vincent Alderman." "Yes." "He was a watchmaker in Calvert, Indiana. For most of his life." "Yes." Dr. Cho was quiet for a moment. He was also, for the better part of 3 decades, a technical asset to a program that no longer officially exists. I stared at him. "His shop was a dead drop and a signal station," Dr. Cho said. "In the 1970s and into the 1980s, a network of civilians in ordinary occupations were recruited to support the transfer of scientific intelligence during the Cold War, not spies in the traditional sense, more like infrastructure. People whose lives were unremarkable enough to be invisible. A watchmaker in Indiana was exactly the right kind of invisible." I looked at the watch on the table. "The engraving," I said. "An identifier," he said. "An identifier," he said. "Each asset in the network had one, issued when they were brought in. The code linked them to their handler, their region, and their clearance level. If you knew how to read it, you knew who you were dealing with and how much to trust them. Most of the watches were recovered when the program wound down. Some weren't. He kept his. Apparently. Dr. Cove." Cho picked up his coffee cup but didn't drink from it. "I was a young researcher at the time, just starting out. I interfaced with the network on the technical side. I knew who some of the assets were, not by name always, but by identifier. I knew this one." He tapped the edge of the watch lightly. "Your grandfather relayed technical documentation, measurements, schematics, engineering data that needed to move quietly and quickly between people who couldn't be seen communicating. He didn't have a physics degree. He didn't need one. He had the judgment to know what he was holding, the discipline to move it correctly, and the sense to never ask more than he needed to know." "For how long?" I asked. 26 years, Dr. Cho said. "Give or take. 26 years. My grandfather had fixed watches for 26 years, while also doing something that I could not fully comprehend yet. He woke up every morning, opened his shop, repaired customers' heirlooms, and went home to a house in Indiana that no one looked at twice." "Did he choose this?" I asked. "He was approached," Dr. Cho said. "In those programs, people always chose. They weren't always told the full scope of what they were choosing, but no one was forced. He agreed, and he stayed, and he never broke. Never? Not once that I know of. And I would know. I drove home in a fog. 3 hours on the highway feeling like I was driving through a city I had never been to before, recognizing all the road signs but not quite believing them. When I got back to my apartment, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the watch under the light for a long time. The characters in the bezel were so small and clean. 30 years of keeping that secret, and this was all he had held on to. Not documents, not proof. Just this small, plain, functional thing with its coated ring and its scratched case. I found the letter the next morning. I had been through his desk twice already, but I had not looked inside the false bottom of the narrow center drawer, because I hadn't known it was false until I bumped the side and heard the hollow sound. The envelope was small and unsealed, which told me he had put it there recently, close enough to the end that he was thinking about it. The handwriting was steady, which told me it had been written before the worst of it. If you found the watch, then you found this. And if you found this, then it was you. I always thought it would be you. I spent most of my adult life doing work I couldn't describe. I don't say that to make it sound important. I say it because it meant that the people who loved me never got to know the parts of me I was most careful about. That's not a complaint. It was a choice I made, and I'd make it again. But I want you to know that when I sat with you on that porch and talked about things that didn't matter, it was the truest I ever got to being myself with anyone. You asked me once what the letters on the watch meant. I told you it was a game. It wasn't a game. It was proof that I existed in a way no one was allowed to see. I kept it for the same reason you'll probably keep reading this. Because some things need to be known, even if only by one person. You were always the one who paid attention. I hope that doesn't cost you anything. I love you more than I ever said out loud. That's its own kind of failure, and I own it. Grandpa, I read it 4 times before I put it down. Then I sat in my kitchen and cried in a way I hadn't since I was a child. Not the tidy, controlled kind of crying I had done at the funeral, standing at the grave while the cold came in off the fields. The kind that comes from understanding something too late. The kind that has nowhere to go but out. He had known. He had known I would be the one to find it. He had prepared for me specifically. And I had spent his last years calling on Sundays and visiting twice a year, and thinking that was enough, and he had never once told me it wasn't, because he was the kind of man who didn't say things like that. I called my mother the next day. I told her about Dr. Cho. I told her about the program. I told her about 26 years of classified civilian service that had hidden inside the most ordinary life any of us had ever overlooked. She was quiet for so long, I thought the call had dropped. That's not possible, she finally said. He was a watchmaker. That was his cover. Mom. She always called me that when she was flustered, the habit she'd had since I was small. Your grandfather didn't have a cover. He was just a man who fixed things. He was boring. She stopped. I let the silence hold. He was always busy in that shop, she said after a moment. When I was young, even when we didn't have customers, he'd be back there for hours, and I never really thought about why. Because it was normal, I said. He made it normal. She didn't say anything. You let him die without visiting, I said. Not to wound her, but because it was true. Not once in the last year. He asked about you every time I called. He didn't complain. He just asked. My mother made a sound I had never heard from her before. I thought he was fine, she said. He always seemed fine. He was always fine, I said. That was the skill. I flew to Phoenix 2 weeks later. Not to punish anyone, but because I needed to say the rest of it in person. My mother met me at the door looking tired. My father sat at the kitchen table. My uncle had driven over, which surprised me. He hadn't mentioned coming. I put the watch on the table. Then the letter. My mother read the letter first. One hand pressed flat against the table like she needed something to hold on to. My father read it after her. My uncle asked to read it, and I nodded, and he read it standing up, which meant he was done before the other two had finished processing. I told you he was boring, my uncle said. Gerald, my mother said. I'm not saying it as an insult, he said. He sounded far away. I'm saying I decided who he was when I was 15 years old and I never changed my mind, even when there was evidence. He set the letter down. That envelope from the shop. He had a customer who came in once a year with an envelope and left without a receipt. I saw it maybe 3 or 4 times growing up. I thought it was someone settling an old debt. He paused. I never asked. My father looked at the watch on the table and didn't pick it up. I thought he'd had enough time, he said. Every year I thought, we'll do more next year. Get out there more, call more, stay longer. He shook his head slowly. There's no next year now. There wasn't for him either, I said. And he knew that. He just never made any of you feel guilty about it. My mother covered her face with both hands. Because he was kind, she said into her palms. And I let him be kind without deserving it. We sat in that kitchen for a long time. No one moved to make coffee. No one turned on the television. The only sound was the clock on the microwave, and, at one point, a car going by outside. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't the kind of conversation that fixes anything. It was the kind that just settles, like sediment finding the bottom of a jar. Slow and quiet and nowhere close to done. Doctor? Cho contacted me one more time after that a few weeks later, through an email that arrived without a subject line. He had spoken with 2 former colleagues from the program. There were partial records, redacted beyond most usefulness, but enough. They confirmed what he had told me. They confirmed the identifier on the watch, and one of them, a woman who had been a program coordinator in the Chicago office in the 1980s, had written a single sentence that Dr. Cho included at the bottom of his email without comment. He was the most reliable person we ever had, and we never told him. I printed it out and put it in the tin with the watch and my grandfather's letter, and a photograph I had found in one of the shop drawers. My grandfather, maybe 45, standing in front of the shop with the door open behind him and one hand in his coat pocket. He is not smiling, exactly, but there is something in his expression that I had never noticed in any photograph I'd seen before. A kind of composure that is not the same as emptiness, the look of someone who is holding something and holding it well. I wear the watch now, not on my wrist, because it's a pocket watch, and I don't have the right coat for it. I keep it in the front pocket of my work bag. I check it sometimes throughout the day, the way people do when they want to know what time it is, except that's not actually what I'm checking. My mother calls more now. Not dramatically more. Not in a way that would make for a good redemption story. Just more. She asks questions she didn't used to ask. She mentioned recently that she'd been going through her own things and found a birthday card he'd sent her when she turned 40 with a check folded inside for $100 and a note in his handwriting, "Spend this on something that has no practical use whatsoever." She laughed telling me about it and then got quiet. "I don't remember what I spent it on," she said. "Probably something practical," I said. "Probably." My uncle donated a clock to the Calvert Public Library in my grandfather's name. It hangs in the reading room now. Nothing fancy. A regulator clock, wall-mounted, the kind you'd find in a schoolroom 100 years ago. Simple face, clean lines, good movement. It keeps perfect time. My father drove out to Calvert in the fall and walked through the town by himself. He didn't tell us he was going. He just mentioned it afterward, quietly, like it was something he'd needed to do and had finally gotten around to. He said he'd stopped at the building where the shop used to be. It's a sandwich place now. I stood outside for about 10 minutes, he said. The kids inside probably thought I was nuts. "Were you okay?" I asked. "I was thinking about how many times I drove past that shop when he was alive and never stopped," he said. "Not even once." I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say. I still work in Cincinnati. Long days, a lot of movement, the particular exhaustion of work that is done with your hands and your attention at the same time. I take the bus most mornings. I sit in the back, usually, where it's quiet. I notice things differently now. The retired man who stands at the same corner every morning and picks up whatever litter the wind has brought in overnight, without acknowledgement, without apparent purpose, just because it needs doing. The woman at the pharmacy counter who knows every regular customer's prescription schedule by memory and has clearly never been thanked for it. The janitor at the clinic where I work who keeps a small notebook in his breast pocket and writes things in it during his breaks, and who told me once, when I asked, that he'd been writing in notebooks since he was 12 and had filled over 60 of them with things no one had ever read. My grandfather spent 26 years doing something the world was never supposed to know about. He came home at the end of each day to a gray house and a quiet street and a life that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. He did it well enough that his own daughter didn't know. He did it well enough that the people who sent him his quiet annual reminders never once had to correct him. He didn't do it for recognition. He probably knew he'd never get any. He did it because someone asked him and he was the right person and he said yes, and then he kept saying yes for longer than most people stay married. That is the thing I keep turning over. Not the Cold War history. Not the redacted files or the classified network or the program that no longer officially exists. Just the simple, stubborn fact of a man who showed up, year after year, in a small shop on a small street in a small town, and did something the world needed without the world ever knowing to thank him. He fixed things. That was always the truest sentence about him. He just fixed more things than any of us knew. If there is someone in your life who seems ordinary, who is always steady, who makes no demands and asks for very little and is just quietly, reliably, there, pay attention to them. Not because they're hiding something, just because they're worth it. Just because the people who don't ask to be seen are often the ones who have the most to show you. And because, someday, you will go through their things after they are gone, and you will wish, with your whole chest, that you had asked